Year 12s, this will be a test review for energy systems. So please make sure that you're filling in all the answers you got incorrect, or putting additional notes next to those answers to make sure that your learning is consolidated. So this first question, a couple of short answer ones. First one, what is ATP? So we know that ATP is building block for energy. So some people just wrote the extended word. You need to sort of explain what it is. A couple of people mistake was to name ATP PC, which we know is the system, but ATP is that building block of energy. Question 2, if you look at the table there, the intensity being 100% and the duration being less than 10 seconds suggests it's the ATP PC system. You needed to refer to the table to get those 2 marks. So if you just wrote ATP PC system, you would have got 1, and you needed specific data from the table to complete that answer. Multiple choice there. So the following groups competitive activities from the aerobic system. So we had 1500 metre swim, cross-country ski, and 1500 metre run. Question 4, which was C, sorry. Question 4, which is also C, if you're looking at the appropriate breakdown of systems for a 400 metre run, we're looking at lactic acid being the primary system there at 70%, and then we would have worked through the PC system, so that 20% being the higher one there. So C was the answer as well. Next question 5, explain the main source of energy for a volleyballer who spikes the ball the first play of the second set followed by a 2-minute break. So if we're looking at that 2-minute break, mentioning that 2-minute break, that we would have had enough recovery time to replenish, 2/3 of our PC system or PC stores. So we're looking at that first play that would have to be less than 8 seconds in total to perform that play. So it has to be the PC system. To get the 2 marks, you would have had to mention something like that. Again, pulling something from the question as well. When playing centre in netball, was predominant fuel used? So people talked about systems, being the lactic acid system or the aerobic system, but glycogen is the first point of call for the fuel. Even for working aerobically, we're still working at a high percentage in that lactic acid system where glycogen is the main source of fuel. Performing a 15-second explosive effort, the athlete would be limited by. So again, I was a bit flexible here, so people could have mentioned lactic acid accumulation, but also PC depletion. So your phosphate creatine depletion would initially be that limit there, and then moving into some sort of lactic acid accumulation, but you wouldn't have had much after 15 seconds. Question 8, refer to that graph. So K there, you can see the trend being that the arm flexor strength for the women as that increases, and the men as well increase with the cross-sectional area. So that was fairly straightforward there. With a diagram, chemical breakdown, you'll know that in your book. It's ATP, and then as we move away and break away the one molecule, then energy is released, and then when we resynthesize, it's the other way with our energy systems. If you don't have that correct, please go to your resources and copy that diagram down. Question 10, the primary food fuel again for energy production in the later stages of submaximal physical activity would be, I sort of suggested fat would be the one there as we're working sort of in the later stage of submaximal physical activity. We might have used all our glycogen, but fat would be the better answer there. Which 2 of the following physiological characteristics would be increased by creatine supplementation? Again, not something that we've specifically gone through, but if we're supplementing creatine, then that's going to increase our phosphocreatine stores. And if we're looking at resynthesizing ATP by using our PC system, if we're supplementing that, then that would be increased. So A is the answer there. Other than depletion of muscle glycogen stores, what are the main 2 causes of fatigue for endurance athletes? So we're looking at things like in the later stage of endurance athletes, there would be some sort of lactic acid build-up, depending on the amount of the intensity they're going. They might be going up a hill or chasing a pack or things like that. But also dehydration would be a cause of fatigue. Question 13, identify an athletic event for each of those. fairly straightforward. Most people got this right. So lactic acid, 400 metre sprint, PC, 100 metre sprint, and then aerobic like a triathlon. Some people did write 1500 metres. I think I took half a mark off for that. Please disregard that. 1500 metres was sort of indicated in the one of the previous questions. Alright, on to part B. So these were some questions taken straight from exams. So they had 2 or 3 parts to them. So we can see there a table which is showing movement analysis of a sport that involve jogging, tackling, jumps, kicks, sprints, things like that. So identify 2 energy systems predominantly used by the player. I sort of accepted as long as you weren't able to name 2 of the 3, then that was fine. I think everyone got that right. Just when the specific examples came in. So you needed to be able to pull an example off the table. And I've given an example there for each. So if you're talking about PC, you have to mention 10 jumps or 15 kicks. Lactic acid, you want to be specific to that. Maybe talk about the latter stages. And the aerobic was the jogging in the 4 kilometres there at the submax. So it's again, that's where people lost half a mark or a mark, was when they weren't talking about the specific nature of what was coming off that table. 2 talked about the multi-stage fitness test, and then sources of fuel. So some people gave really good answers about the systems that were being used and like an interplay question. So I gave some marks for that, but we were looking at what fuel. So some people gave some really good answers about working aerobically at the start and maybe using fat. Some people talked about oxygen deficit at the start, working aerobically, but having that lactic acid sort of chiming in there as well, and then having to use glycogen as a result of that. Some people talked about working aerobically and then having glycogen as their primary fuel. So they were all good answers. But in terms of the latter stages, as the intensity increased, definitely carbohydrates or glycogen were the main source of fuel. And then post lactate threshold, definitely carbohydrates and glycogen. So there's some really good answers there, some diverse answers. This one, first one, A there, for, looking at the graph. So that was simply as the intensity of the exercise increased, the use of carbohydrates increased. You could tell that off the graph, but also we should have a fairly good understanding of that concept. B, why would it be a disadvantage for an endurance athlete if they're carrying excess body fat? So one of the answers could have been dead weight, which caused an athlete to use more energy for the same movement, or the higher percentage of body fat actually being restricting the blood flow to the muscles, so therefore less O2 is getting the muscles, lower lactate threshold, which could mean the athlete, if they're trying to work at that same intensity, they have to rely more on the lactic acid system, which would cause more accumulation, which would cause more fatigue. C there, why would the female runner feel more fatigue at the end if primary fuel was fats? So fats just being harder to break down, take more energy to break them down, thus more fatigue at that point of the race. Last sort of question here, looking at that table, again breaking down the movements of the different activity. So A, with some specific to table 2, identify when the ATP-CP system would make the highest contribution of energy. So you need to pull information off the graph. So I've done that there. Just an example of sprinting, 19 reps at 3 seconds duration on average. That's where it'd be, and you can talk about the high intensity and the low duration there. As we move on to the next deeper question, looking at the interplay of energy systems, so making sure we're making specific reference to the data. So ATP-PC, looking at the sprinting efforts, so 19 to 3 seconds duration on average, or the initial phase of evading opponents, 25 at 2 seconds duration, again talking about high intensity, short duration, so that sort of language. Lactic acid, you could talk about those types of high intensity efforts at the backstage of those, so maybe, sprinting effort number 14, 15, 16 if we didn't have the appropriate recovery period. And then aerobic was, you mentioned definitely the periods of interchange, 7 of them at 110 seconds, which would allow for recovery PC stores, which would have meant that we could hopefully work for a greater period of time in the PC system, meaning less fatigue. So that, again, tying all those things together would have got you the 5. Most people did reasonably well, sort of got between 3 and 4. Last question, looking at male athletes on average having a greater aerobic capacity than female athletes. explain the physical advantage of that. So greater aerobic capacity, purely looking at more O2 coming in during the epoch stage. So you would need to mention the epoch stage, more O2 coming in that epoch stage, which makes that recovery process more efficient, so quicker replenishment of PC and removal of lactic acid. All right, make sure that you're spending that time going through those questions, looking at the answers I've given, listen to the explanation, so that we can learn off that and improve the next test. Thanks.